We stand at one of history's most extraordinary crossroads. The Temple Institute in Jerusalem has spent approximately $27 million preparing to rebuild what they call Solomon's Temple. Around the world, Christians, Jews, and countless others watch with a mixture of awe and expectation, believing this reconstruction will inaugurate a glorious new era for humanity. This is the dawn of prophecy fulfilled, the return of divine favor, and the beginning of peace on earth. But beneath all this hope lies a haunting question that refuses to stay buried. What if the temple they long to rebuild never stood at all? The truth of the matter is that King Solomon never existed, and neither did his temple. This isn't speculation or a conspiracy theory. It is the definitive conclusion reached by some of Israel's most distinguished archaeologists after decades of careful excavation and analysis. The implications are catastrophic, shaking the foundations not only of religion but of civilization itself. If there was no Solomon, no temple, no ancient Israel as described in Scripture, then what exactly is the Temple Institute rebuilding? And why are millions of believers investing their faith and their money in what may be history's most elaborate archaeological myth? Beneath the sun-bleached hills of ancient Israel, archaeologists once sought the kingdom of Solomon, a realm said to shimmer with divine wisdom and unearthly wealth. For centuries, this tale was not merely a story. This was the foundation of Western history and theology. It offered a timeline, a spiritual geography that anchored Judaism, Christianity, and Islam alike. The Age of Solomon was considered the golden dawn of civilization. It is the proof that God's hand once shaped empires. But when Israel Finkelstein and Neil Asher Silberman, two of the most respected archaeologists in the region, began to peel away the sands of time, their discoveries told a different story. After decades of digging across the very heartlands of Judah and Israel, across Megiddo, Hazor, Gezer, and Jerusalem, their conclusion was as clear as it was unsettling. There was no evidence at all. No grand palaces, no inscriptions, no gold-filled treasuries, not even a single monument bearing his name. The supposed empire that stretched from the Nile to the Euphrates, as the saying went, was nowhere to be found in the geological or cultural record. It had left behind no scars in the stone, no echo in the dust. We have found no trace of the great culture that Solomon supposedly developed, wrote Donald Redford, a leading scholar of the period. For archaeologists accustomed to finding civilizations where texts promised them, this absence spoke louder than any discovery. Across the Near East, Egypt's pharaohs and Assyria's kings had immortalized their power in stone and clay. They built temples that still tower over the desert, recorded wars on carved reliefs, and filled museums with evidence of their rule. But in the case of Solomon, this supposedly golden monarch whose wisdom drew queens from foreign lands, the ground remained silent. Where the Bible spoke of monumental projects, the soil yielded little more than the remains of modest hilltop settlements. But what did this even mean for the two archaeologists? To an archaeologist, absence is a kind of presence. It speaks through what is not found. The ground of ancient Israel whispered something uncomfortable. The Bible's empire was never a political power. It was a literary creation, a story born centuries earlier during the exile or early post-exilic period, when scattered people sought to reclaim their identity by crafting a mythic past. Solomon's kingdom, in this light, was never a nation, but an idea, a vision of divine order projected backward through time. But what does this mean for the temple? If any single structure was meant to anchor Solomon's legend in reality, it was the Temple of Jerusalem, a building the Bible portrays as one of the wonders of the ancient world. According to the Book of Kings, it took 7 years in construction, with over 180,000 laborers. It was clad in gold and precious stone, lined with cedar from Lebanon, gold from Ophir, and stones of such size that they seemed to be moved by divine hands. Its design, it was believed, was revealed directly by God. This was the architectural heart of divine human contact, the literal dwelling place of the Creator on earth. Yet, here too, the record dissolves into silence. Excavations on and around the Temple Mount, some dating back to the 19th century, have never uncovered a trace of Solomon's magnificent sanctuary. Not a fragment of the foundation, not a tool or inscription, not even the remnants of a wall that could be securely linked to this era. The meticulous records of archaeologists, from the Ottoman era to modern Israel, all say the same thing. There is no evidence of a temple built in the 10th century BCE. The archaeological evidence in Jerusalem for the famous building projects of Solomon, writes Neil Silberman, is non-existent. This silence becomes even more striking when we take other archaeological evidence. From the same centuries, we possess temples from Egypt, palaces from Mesopotamia, and administrative archives detailing the economies of distant kingdoms. We know how those civilizations processed stones, mobilized workers, and recorded their victories. If a temple as grand as Solomon's had truly stood in Jerusalem, its remains would not have vanished without a whisper. Instead, the evidence points to a humbler reality, one that stands in contrast to the splendor of biblical imagination. Beneath the layers of sacred myth, what emerges is not the seat of an empire, but the faint imprint of a small highland community, scattered among the hills of ancient Judah. These were not kings in marble halls, but shepherds, potters, and farmers living in stone dwellings, clinging to the edges of survival. Their tools were simple, their trade was limited, and their architecture was unremarkable. This was the reality of their world, and this is not hearsay, it's backed by archaeology. Archaeological surveys show that during the 10th century BCE, the very era in which Solomon is said to have reigned, Jerusalem was little more than a modest hilltop town. Its population was scarcely a few thousand. There were no great fortifications, no monumental gates, no palaces, and certainly no evidence of a centralized bureaucracy capable of managing the wealth and armies described in Scripture. The land itself bears witness. The pottery is coarse. The urban layout is primitive. The agricultural terraces are small. This was not the glittering heart of an empire, but a frontier of faith, a loose confederation of villages bound not by an empire, but by shared stories, shared symbols, and a fragile hope in divine favor. In such a world, myth was not deception, it became identity. The people of these highlands lacked gold and armies, but they possessed something infinitely more enduring, a narrative, powerful enough to outlast the very empires in their myths. Over generations, these scattered tribes wove their collective memory into the tapestry of Scripture. The hardships of survival became moral lessons, and with it, the yearning for order and justice became the blueprint for a king ordained by God. Out of poverty, they fashioned majesty, the kingdom of Solomon. In this light, was not discovered in the soil, and it had a reason. It was built in the soul, a mythic construct that transformed a cluster of rural settlements into the imagined center of the world. In a sense, this is the true genius of ancient Israel. Lacking the monumental architecture of Egypt or Babylon, it built instead a monument of meaning. The people who could not conquer with weapons conquered with words. They gave the world an empire of the mind, where the ideas of justice, wisdom, and divine covenant would outlast every physical kingdom. Thus, the humble highlands, with their scattered farms and shepherds' flocks, became the birthplace of a vision that would shape the moral and spiritual consciousness of half the world. What the Bible described as a glittering empire was, in truth, a spiritual reconstruction of a much smaller, humbler world. A landscape elevated to eternity through the power of belief. But good beliefs are nothing if not met with a good marketing strategy. So just how was this idea propagated throughout the world? As the earth refused to yield evidence of Solomon's glory, relics began to appear elsewhere, not from the dust of ancient ruins, but from the hands of collectors and dealers. Seals inscribed with royal names, fragments of inscriptions, and temple relics bearing biblical motifs surfaced in private markets across Jerusalem and the Greater Levant. Each artifact seemed to whisper, "The story is true." Each find promised to fill the silence of history with the music of faith. But archaeology is a patient discipline, and truth demands more than desire. Scholars soon noticed a strange pattern. The same kind of artifacts that were never found in controlled professional excavations appeared with suspicious abundance in the open market. In digs led by trained teams with maps, grids, and carbon dating, inscribed objects were exceedingly rare. Yet, in the bazaars of antiquity, they emerged by the carloads, as Israel Finkelstein once remarked. These objects carried the weight of hope. For the faithful, they were tangible bridges between the world of Scripture and the realm of science. Sacred proof that the Bible was not merely a book of stories, but a record of history. For the sellers, they were commodities, each relic fetching prices that reflected the intensity of belief it could satisfy. The market became a theater of longing. Every discovery promised redemption for the doubter, reassurance for the devout, and profit for the opportunist. An inscription bearing Solomon's name could restore faith because it was a temple vessel that could confirm prophecy. And when faith itself becomes currency, the temptation to forge miracles becomes irresistible. One infamous example was the Jehoash inscription, a stone tablet supposedly describing the repairs made to Solomon's temple, the very relic that believers had dreamed of. When it surfaced in 2001, it was hailed as the most important biblical artifact ever found. But upon analysis, its patina, the thin layer of aging that forms over centuries, turned out to be synthetic, a modern concoction designed to mimic antiquity. What many thought was divine validation was, in truth, a clever imitation of faith. Such forgeries are not merely frauds against scholarship. They are reflections of a deeper human yearning. They show how desperately people seek physical proof of the unseen, how the absence of evidence can become an ache that markets rush to soothe. The relics may be false, but the desire behind them is profoundly real. It is the same desire that once moved those early Highland villagers, the longing to belong to a story larger than themselves. When the soil fails to speak, the imagination becomes the final archaeologist. And when imagination and commerce meet, myth is reborn not in temples, but in shop windows. Each forged artifact, each polished stone, is a mirror showing humanity's uneasy relationship with its own faith. It serves as a reminder that the truths most deeply held are not always the ones that can be held in the hand. So all this brings us back to the man in the spotlight. Who was Solomon, and how did his story come to influence so many centuries later than his supposed existence? To glimpse what might lie behind the Solomon narrative, one must look beyond archaeology to language itself. That ancient architecture of meaning that often hides the oldest truths in plain sight. Words, like ruins, are built in layers. Beneath the surface of a name, one can sometimes find entire civilizations of thought buried and forgotten. And few names carry as much weight, mystery, and cultural inheritance as Solomon. In the Hebrew Bible, Shlomo derives from shalom, which translates to peace, which makes Solomon mean man of peace, or the king of wisdom. But the name migrated across tongues and epochs through Greek, Latin, and English. And then something interesting happened. It began to fracture, revealed to carry an echo older than Hebrew, as a whisper of something universal. Broken apart, it forms 3 syllables: sol, om, on. Each one resonates with ancient meanings of the sun. Sol, which is the Latin name for the sun god. Om, the sacred sound of creation in Hindu philosophy, symbolizing the divine vibration that brings about existence. On, the Egyptian name for Heliopolis, or the city of the sun, the spiritual heart of solar worship. 3 cultures, 3 eras, 1 symbol, the sun, or, as it's seen, source of life, sight, and renewal. It's a linguistic coincidence so elegant that it begs deeper reflection. Could it be that Solomon was never meant to signify a historical figure at all, but rather to embody a universal archetype, something that teaches the solar principle, or the inner light that governs both the cosmos and consciousness? Across the ancient world, the sun was the purest metaphor for the divine. It rose and fell in a rhythm that mirrored the human soul's journey, from darkness to illumination, from death to rebirth. To the Egyptians, the sun's daily voyage across the sky was Ra's eternal victory over chaos. To the Greeks, Apollo's chariot carried light and order to the world. And to later mystics and philosophers, the sun came to symbolize wisdom itself, the intellect illuminated by divine fire. The name of a supposed king becomes the name of a cosmic force. Under this lens, the story of Solomon begins to shimmer differently. The king who asked for wisdom, the monarch whose radiance drew pilgrims from distant lands, becomes a personification of illumined consciousness, not as a sovereign of stone, but of spirit. His temple, the legendary structure that housed divine presence, becomes not a physical sanctuary but a metaphor for the perfected soul. So where does scripture and reality meet? If Solomon's temple was never a building of stone, perhaps it was never meant to be. For in nearly every ancient teaching, the temple represents the human being, body, mind, and spirit, aligned as a vessel for the divine. The inner sanctum, the Holy of Holies, is the heart, where the spark of divine consciousness dwells. The outer courts are the scenes, throughout which the soul engages the material world. To build the temple, then, is to cultivate one's self, to refine thought and action until the inner light, or soul, on, shines unobstructed. Seen in this way, the Bible's meticulous architectural descriptions of Solomon's temple cease to be engineering blueprints and become psychological allegory. The measurements, the gold, the pillars of Jachin and Boaz all point toward esoteric principles of balance, order, and harmony. The proportions mirror sacred geometry, the same ratios that govern both the structure of the cosmos and the rhythm of consciousness. The temple's 7-year construction echoes the ancient motif of spiritual contemplation through the number 7, the 7 days of creation, the 7 chakras, the 7 classical planets, all pointing to the same pattern of wholeness. In this route, the detailed architectural descriptions in Scripture no longer seem out of place. They read instead like blueprints for the soul, with precise measurements for a spiritual purity erected through discipline, contemplation, and devotion. Every wall, pillar, and chamber mirrors a stage in the refinement of being. It is not the work of masons and metals, but of thought, will, and moral discipline. In the allegory, the temple is never finished. Even when its outer form is completed, its inner meaning remains a living process. The human being is always under construction, forever building, tearing down and rebuilding the inner sanctuary where divine understanding may dwell. This is where the legend of Hiram Abiff enters as a crucial key. In Masonic tradition, Hiram is the chief architect commissioned by Solomon to build the temple. He was a master of geometry, balance, and sacred proportion. But as the story unfolds, he becomes the embodiment of something far more profound: the spiritual craftsman, the custodian of divine knowledge, betrayed and slain before his work is complete. His murder by 3 fellow builders is not a literal act of jealousy, it is a mythic drama of consciousness. The 3 ruffians who strike Hiram down represent the lower impulses that destroy wisdom: ignorance, which blinds the eyes, passion, which weakens the heart, and materialism, which corrupts the will. Each blow drives the sacred knowledge deeper into obscurity, burying the secret of creation within the human psyche. In Masonic ritual, initiates symbolically seek the body of Hiram, not to recover a man, but to rediscover the lost principle he represents. When they raise him from his shallow grave, they are reenacting the resurrection of wisdom, the awakening of light within darkness. The so-called lost word that dies with Hiram is another allegory. It is a metaphor for the forgotten unity between divine intelligence and human understanding. The original language of the cosmos, the vibrational seed through which creation was spoken into being. In Kabbalistic thought, it echoes the Tetragrammaton, or the 4-letter name of God that cannot be uttered, only contemplated. In Hermetic philosophy, it corresponds to the Logos, the Word that is God, through which all things were made. And in the Eastern traditions, it is mirrored by the sacred syllable Om, the cosmic resonance that is the foundation for all existence. Thus, the search for the lost word is nothing less than the search for unity, the attempt to reconcile the human voice with the divine vibration. When the literalists of later ages took these mysteries at face value, the allegory hardened into history. The inner temple became a political project. The symbolic king became a national ancestor. The lost word reimagined a creed to be defended rather than a truth to be rediscovered. And so humanity began to search for what was never lost, in the dust of Jerusalem, instead of in the quiet of the soul. In this sense, the Temple Institute's project is both tragic and deeply human. It reflects the same impulse that forged artifacts and rewrote myths: the yearning to make the invisible visible, to carve the eternal into stone. Yet the wisdom encoded in the name of Solomon whispers a different message: that the true temple is built not by architects or archaeologists, but by seekers of light. But where is the proof for this? Well, it's ever present in the modern world. Even across oceans and centuries, the symbol of the temple reappears, most strikingly on the back of the US dollar bill. The unfinished pyramid crowned by the all-seeing eye speaks the same ancient language. The pyramid's 13 levels represent stages of human progress, while the floating capstone with its radiant and unbound nature signifies enlightenment itself. The Latin phrases "Anit coeptis," or "He favors our undertakings," and "Novus Ordo Seclorum," which is "a new order of the ages," echo a spiritual rather than political message, that human civilization, like the pyramid, remains incomplete until it is crowned by wisdom. Far from the conspiracies that later surrounded it, this symbol was born from the same deep insight that shaped the story of Solomon's temple, that humanity is in the midst of a great construction period, not of stone, but of consciousness. But if this is the truth, why is it covered up? The reluctance to accept this symbolic reading is not merely theological, it is economic. An entire industry thrives on the belief that the Bible's stories are literal history. Tourism, excavation grants, pilgrimages, and the sale of artifacts all depend on the idea that Solomon's temple once stood in glory and can be rebuilt again. If that illusion crumbles, so too does a vast network of profit and control. Faith becomes harder to monetize when it turns inward. It is easier to sell tickets to ruins than to teach the architecture of the soul. But the cost of clinging to literalism is immense. It redirects spiritual longing into material ambition. It convinces believers that holiness can be constructed from stone and mortar rather than cultivated within the heart. When the dust of myth settles, what remains is not despair, but revelation. The story of Solomon, like the myths of Ra, Apollo, and Christ, belongs to a universal language of symbols. Each expresses the same truth in its own tongue, that light, whether solar or spiritual, is the source of life and consciousness. This perennial philosophy, as some have called it, threads through every faith. Beneath the surface differences of scripture and ritual, it reveals a shared wisdom, that the divine is not a distant ruler, but a living presence within every being. To rebuild Solomon's temple, then, is not to raise walls in Jerusalem, but to awaken the temple within. The real sanctuary stands in consciousness, waiting for the builder's return. Its stones are compassion, patience, and self-knowledge. Its capstone is illumination, the moment one recognizes that the divine light long sought in the heavens burns quietly within the self. The tragedy is not that humanity once lost this temple, but that it forgot where to look for it. The millions spent on bricks and blueprints could instead nurture the architects of the inner world, those willing to undertake the long, silent labor of self-transformation. As Jesus once said, "The kingdom of heaven is within you." The Masons preserved the same truth through symbols, that the light shining from the eye above the pyramid, the wisdom at the heart of Solomon's legend, the spark buried within the soul, are all one and the same. The real temple has never fallen because it was never built of stone. It waits in the quiet corner of every mind, ready to rise to the moment when we begin the work within. The only question is, are you willing to put in the work to rebuild the glorious temple of the soul?